World of Warcraft, Tides of Darkness, by Aaron Rosenberg. Chapter 15. "Let's go!" Doomhammer shouted. "Get your gear and let's get moving!" He watched the warriors for a moment as the chieftain shouted and shoved and punched them to get them ready, then turned back to Gul'dan, who stood waiting patiently by. "What?" he demanded. "My clan and I will remain here for a time," Gul'dan replied. "I have other plans for the Altar of Storms, plans that will aid the Horde in its conquest." Doomhammer frowned. He still did not trust the short, ugly warlock, but he had to admit that the two-headed ogres had proven immensely useful in the battle to take Quel'Thalas. True, those cursed dwarves and the griffin has interfered and cost him several of the creatures, but without the ogres, they might have not broken the alliance lines and been able to regroup. Finally, he nodded. "Do what you must," he told Gul'dan, "but do not take long. We will need every advantage if we want to conquer Lordaeron quickly." "I will not delay," Gul'dan assured him, grinning. "You are right. Speed is of the essence." The way he said it troubled Doomhammer, but just then Zulahad came running up and the chief warlock slipped away from Doomhammer's penetrating gaze while he was listening to the latest report about the forest's remaining defenders. "We cannot breach their defenses," the Dragonmaw chieftain was saying. He looked more angry than apologetic. "Even the dragons can do nothing," he insisted, shaking his head. "Their fire washes over the city, but does not touch it, and their claws are repelled by an invisible barrier they cannot break." "It is the Sunwell," Gul'dan commented, turning back to take part in the conversation. "The elven source of magic. It gives them immense power." Of course the warlock would know about such a thing, Doomhammer reasoned. "Is there any way to destroy it, or drain it, or tap it for ourselves?" he asked, but Gul'dan shook his head. "I've tried," he admitted. "I can feel its power, but it's kind of unfamiliar to me, and I cannot touch it." He scratched at his bristly beard. "I suspect only the elves can gain its power, for it is tied to them and this land." "Can you use the altars to break their defenses?" was Doomhammer's next question. Gul'dan grinned again. "That is one of the things I am attempting," he replied. "I do not know if it will work, but the altars are crafted from the elven-owned rune stones, which were originally powered by the Sunwell. It may be able to use that link in reverse, sending my own magic into the power source and either destroying it or wresting it away from them." It was clear which one the warlock would prefer, and Doomhammer disliked the idea of placing such potency in his hands, but that would still be better than leaving it to the strange, silent, deadly elves. "Do what you can," he told Gul'dan again, "but breaching the city is secondary. We can't get it right now, but they cannot get out either." He turned back to Zulahad, who was still waiting. "The same goes for your dragons. We may need them, particularly if the Alliance have more warriors waiting in Capital City. If you have not managed to break their barrier after a few more days, leave it and send your dragons to join the rest of the Horde." He glared at Gul'dan, who had already walked beyond hearing range. "And make sure he and his warlocks accompany you." Zulahad grinned. "I will drag him with us if I have to. Order a dragon to snap him up and carry him in his belly," he promised. Doomhammer nodded, and then he left the Dragonmaw chieftain to speak with his dragon riders and went to make sure his own Blackrock warriors were ready to set out toward their next targets. It was another 2 hours before the Horde finally moved out. Gul'dan and Cho'Gall watched as the waves of the orcs marched from Quel'Thalas, trampling over the charred remains of the trees that had fallen to the dragon's flames. Fully a third of the forest had been burned, and that stretch was littered with soot and ash, and the stray leaf had been crisp but not yet crumbled. The warriors had crammed there, feeling more comfortable in the open air than under the remaining trees, even if the ground was littered with bits of bark and leaf and nuts. And now clouds of soot rose from the many feet stomping back across toward the foothills and the mountains beyond. Doomhammer strode at their head, his long legs eating up the distance, his weapon bouncing slightly against his back legs as he walked. He did not look around, clearly confident that he was in no danger whatsoever. Gul'dan waited until the last marching orc had vanished from view. Then he turned to Cho'Gall. "Are we ready?" Both the Twilight's Hammer chieftains' heads grinned. "Ready!" he replied. Gul'dan nodded. Good. Tell your warriors we march at once. It's a long way back to South Shore. He rubbed at his beard. Zulu Head is occupied with the Elfin City, and will not even notice we have gone until it is too late. What if he sends a dragon after us? Cho'Gall asked. His normal disregard for danger flickered at the thought of those massive creatures hurling down upon them. He will not, Gul'dan assured the ogre. He will not dare do so without Doomhammer's orders, and that means first sending a messenger after the rest of the horde, and then waiting for a reply. We will be well beyond their reach by then. And Doomhammer will not be able to spare any of his remaining troops to come after us, not if he wants to take that human city. He laughed. For weeks he had been trying to think of a way to break free of Doomhammer and pursue his own agenda, and the war chief had actually handed him the perfect solution. He had half expected Doomhammer to insist he accompany the rest of the horde on the march, but the elves' resistance had provided him with the perfect excuse to remain behind. I will see to the warriors, Cho'Gall promised, and turned away, already bellowing orders. Gul'dan nodded and moved on to gather his own gear. He was looking forward to this march. Each step would take him further from Doomhammer, and his careful scrutiny and bring him closer to his destiny. Doomhammer crept down the narrow trail that cut into the mountain peak, heading toward the small valley below. It was night, and the rest of the horde was sleeping, but he had urgent business to attend. He moved silently, his boots finding solid purchase on the well-worn rock, one hand holding his hammer so it did not bounce across his back and glance against the rock walls, the other in front of him, helping him feel his way down the path. The moon was half full overhead, providing him ample light, and he could overhear the chirping of some insects nearby. Otherwise, the mountains were silent. He had nearly reached the valley when he heard different noises, the sound of someone, or something, roughly orc-sized, moving clumsily toward the valley from the far side. Doomhammer crouched down, using the sides of the trail for cover, and tugged his hammer from his shoulder, holding it before him. He peered out cautiously, waiting as the sounds grew louder. Then he saw movement off to one side, and watched as a cloaked figure pulled itself up at the last incline and stepped into the valley. It was not much of a valley, more of a nook, perhaps 20 feet wide and 15 feet deep, but the rocks rose on every side, providing it with both some shelter and a decent concealment. Presumably, that was the reason it had been selected. As Doomhammer watched unmoved, the figure leaned against one of the rocks, gasping for breath, and straightened and looked around. Hello? The cloaked man said softly. I am here, Doomhammer replied, straightening and stepping between the rocks to leave the trail and entering the valley himself. The stranger straightened and gave a small gasp as he approached. Doomhammer could see a longsword at the man's side, well made and unblemished, and knew the stranger had never used it. Why did he repeatedly find himself dealing with cowards and weaklings and schemers, he wondered. Why not warriors who were far more direct in their desires and blunt about their intended methods? He had seen the man leading the Alliance armies at Quel'Thalas and a different man leading them in Hillsbrad, and had been impressed by both. They would be fighters, following a code of honor and respecting strength and honesty. But of course, such men would never have requested a meeting such as this one. You are Lord Doomhammer, the man stammered, shrinking back from him slightly. You speak common. I am Orgrim Doomhammer, chieftain of the Black Rock clan and war chief of the Horde. And I know your tongue, Doomhammer confirmed. And you, human? You sent me that message? I am, the man replied, tugging at his hood as if to make sure it concealed his face. It was of fine cloth, Doomhammer saw, richly embroidered along the hems. I thought it might be best if we met before any unpleasantries occurred. He spoke slowly, as if to a child. Very well. Doomhammer glanced around, making sure the human had not brought assassins. But if so, he was unable to scent or hear them. He had to take the risk that this human really had come alone, as his strange messenger had claimed. I had not expected a human to contact me, Doomhammer admitted quietly, crouching so he could study the man more easily. Especially in such a manner. How is it you humans communicate? By use of trained birds? It is one method, yes, the man replied. I know none of my people would be able to get close enough to convey a message to you, and was unsure how else to reach you, so I sent the bird. Did you kill it? Doomhammer nodded, unable to hold back the grin that crossed his face. The man started and broke into a sweat at the sight. We did not realize it was a messenger until we found the parchment tied to its leg. By then it was too late. I hope you do not want it back. His companion waved the apology aside with one slender gloved hand. His hand shook, but his voice was almost steady. It was only a bird, he pointed out. I'm more interested in preventing a much larger number of regrettable deaths. Doomhammer nodded. So your message said. What do you want from me? Assurances, the man replied. Of what sort? I want your word as a warrior and a leader that you'll keep your warriors in check. The man answered. No killing, raiding, razing, or other atrocities here in the mountains. Leave our cities and villages intact, and do not hound or hunt our people. Doomhammer considered this, idly rubbing his hammer's head with one hand. And what do we get in return? Now the man smiled. A cold expression meant no doubt to be friendly, but seeming only conceiving. Free passage, he answered slowly, letting the two words hang in the still night air. Oh? He answered. Doomhammer tilted his head, indicating that the man should continue. You and your warriors seek to cross the mountains and invade Lordaeron, the man pointed out. These peaks are treacherous, and it is easy for those who know them to combat much larger forces. Your horde might still win, though, but only with heavy losses, and then you would be weakened in your battle against Lordaeron and its defenders. He smiled again and leaned back against the rock, clearly pleased with his reading of the situation and his ability to alter it. I can make sure this region's defenders stay clear of your army, he said confidently. I'll even show you which paths to take to cross the distance more rapidly. Your horde can pass through the mountains quickly and unopposed. Doomhammer considered this. You will clear the way for us, he said out loud, in exchange for our leaving your lands unharmed in return. The man nodded. That is correct. Doomhammer stood and stepped forward until he was less than 2 feet from the man. This close, he could make out some of the stranger's features beneath the hood, and they were narrow, elegant, and calculating, despite his obvious fear. The man reminded him of Gul'dan in some ways, clever and out for his own gain, but most likely too cowardly to betray a stronger force. Very well, he said. I agree. Show me the quickest path through these mountains, and I will lead my warriors through at speed, without stopping for plunder. We will conquer this land and place my protection around these mountains, that none may violate them. You and yours shall be safe. Excellent. The cloaked man smiled and clapped his hands together like a child. I knew you would be reasonable. He pulled a rolled parchment from his belt and handed it to Doomhammer. Here is a map of this area, he explained. I have marked this valley to help you orient it. Doomhammer unrolled the map and studied it. Yes, this is very clear, he said after a moment. Good. The man watched him for a second. I will return to my own people then, he said after a pause. Doomhammer nodded, but did not say anything, and after a moment the man turned and quickly walked away, ducking between rocks and carefully working his way down the cliff beyond the valley. For a moment, Doomhammer considered going after him. A single quick blow would finish such a man. They already had the map. But that would be dishonorable. One of the things he hated about his own people, about what they had become, was their lack of honor. Before, on Draenor, they had been a noble race, but Gul'dan's treachery had changed all that, making them little more than bloodthirsty savages. Doomhammer was determined to restore his race's pride and purity, and that meant following a strict code of behavior. The man had treated him in good faith, and Doomhammer would not betray that. He would follow the path the man had marked, and if it proved quick and the human troops did not block them, he would honor his half of the agreement. With a shake of his head, Doomhammer re-rolled the scroll and stuck it into his own belt, then turned back toward the trail he had used to reach this valley. He would summon his lieutenants once he had returned and show them the route they would take. You summon us, your majesty. General Hath, the commander of Alterax's forces, stood at the half-open door to the map room. Paranoid could see the other army's commanders behind the stout general. "Yes, come in, general officers," Paranoid said, trying to keep his voice calm, beckoning them in. "I have just received some information about the Horde and its movements, and wish to share it with you." He saw Hoth and a few of the others exchange quick glances, but they said nothing as they followed him over to the impressive tapestry map covering the far wall. It showed Alterac from edge to edge, with towns and forts picked out in silver thread, and the castle itself in gold. "I have it under good authority," Paranoid began, "that the Horde is indeed heading towards us." Some of the officers gasped. They apparently plan to invade Lordaeron and have chosen to cross the mountains and approach Capital City from the north side. "How far are they?" General Cavden asked urgently. "How many of them are there? What sort of weapons are they carrying?" Some of the others were murmuring behind him. Paranoid held up a hand, and the officers fell silent. "I do not know how far away they are," he answered, "though I suspect a day, perhaps 2, no more. I have no idea of their numbers, but certainly from all reports they are a formidable force." He smiled, though he knew it was weak. "That, however, is no longer our concern." General Hath straightened. "Not our concern, Your Majesty?" he asked, his breath saying in his thick graying mustache aflutter. "But we are part of the Alliance, and have pledged ourselves to battling the Horde together." "The situation has changed," Paranoid informed him, aware that he was sweating heavily, and that his officers had noticed. "I've reconsidered our options and have decided to realign ourselves in this conflict. Alterac is no longer part of the Alliance, effective immediately." He took a deep breath. "Believe me, we are far better off this way." The officers all looked surprised. "How do you mean, Your Majesty?" Cavdan asked. "I have formed a non-aggression treaty with the Horde," Paranoid replied. "We will no longer hinder their progress through the mountains, and in return they will leave Alterac unharmed and untouched." His officers looked troubled, a few of them even angry or ill. "You would have us conspire with the Orcs, Your Majesty?" Hoth asked softly, disgust evident in his tone. "Yes, I would have us conspire with them," Paranoid snapped, losing his composure. "But I would have us survive." He let his anger and his terror boil over into his words. "Do you have any idea what we are facing? The Horde, the entire Horde, is planning to sweep through these mountains, through our home. Do you have any idea how many of them there are? Thousands. Tens of thousands." Hoth nodded grudgingly, as did a few of the others. They had seen the same reports he had. "And do you have any idea what these orcs are like? I've seen one of them. No further away from me than you are now. They are enormous, as tall as trolls, twice as wide. Massively muscled, with tusks and fangs. This one carried a hammer it would take 3 men to lift, and he waved it about as if it was a child's toy. No man could stand against that. They'll kill us all. Don't you understand? They've already destroyed Stormwind, and Alterac will be next." "But the Alliance," Hoth began. Paranoid laughed bitterly. "The Alliance what?" he demanded. "Where are they now? Not here, I'll tell you that. We formed the Alliance to protect our kingdoms against exactly this sort of attack, but here we are, with the Horde breathing down our necks, and the precious Alliance is nowhere in sight. They've abandoned us, don't you see?" He could hear his voice raising to a near hysteria, and sought to rein it back. "It is every kingdom for itself now," he told them as calmly as he could manage. "I have to think about Alterac first. The other kings would do the same." "Yes, but these brutes," another officer, Triad, stated. "Are monstrous and deadly, yes," Paranoid cut him off, "but they are not incapable of reason. I met with their leader. He spoke common. He listened, and he agreed to leave us in peace if we do not hinder their passage." "Can we trust him?" a junior officer named Varend asked, and Paranoid let out a small sigh, as he saw a few others nod. They were asking that they had already accepted that such a treaty might be necessary. Now that they were only worried about whether it would be upheld. "We have no choice," he replied slowly. They can crush us with barely a thought. If they betray us, we are finished. But if they hold to their word, and I think they will, Alterac will survive, no matter the cost. I still don't like this, Hoth said stubbornly. We gave our word to the other nations. He looked unconcerned, however, and Paranor knew the general was concerning the situation and realizing this might, in fact, be their only hope for survival. You do not have to like it, Paranor replied sharply. You only have to obey. I am king here, and I have made my decision. You have sworn oaths to me, and you will abide by them. He knew that would not stop them if they disagreed, but he hoped he had managed to convince them, at least enough to let their fealty sway them to the rest of the way. Hath studied him for a moment. As you say, your majesty, he stated finally, I will obey. The others nodded as well. Paranor smiled. Good! And as for the alliance, I will accept any and all consequences personally. He turned back towards the map. Now then, the horde will come through here, here, and here, he said, indicating the southern passages on the map. He was annoyed to discover that his hands were shaking. We have merely to leave these passages unmanned, and the horde will pass by without ever encountering a single orc. Hoth was studying the locations. They must be planning to strike Lordaeron from the north, he mused, tracing a line across the edge of the tapestry to where the city would lie if the image continued. I would not have taken that approach myself, but then I don't have their numbers, or their arrogance. He turned back to Paranold, his expression dubious. The men may object, your majesty, he said coldly. They may feel this is a betrayal of our oath, or worse. His tone left little doubt that he agreed with them. If they revolt, we will be unable to stop them. Paranold considered that. Very well, he said after a moment. Tell the soldiers that the horde is planning to use only the 3 northernmost passages. If any ask how you acquired this information, hint that we had scouts and spies discovered it at the cost of their own lives. He nodded, pleased with his own cleverness. That should keep everyone occupied and safely out of the way. Hoth nodded briskly. I will station our men there at once, your majesty, he promised crisply. That is fine, Paranord favored the general with the warmest smile he could manage, to show that all was forgiven. Now, you best get them moving. We don't want to risk the orcs arriving while our troops are still moving into position. The officers saluted and filed out of the map room, except Hath. What is it, General? Paranord asked, not having to fake the weariness in his voice. There has been a message, sire, the general answered, from the Alliance. He arrived while you were resting. Hath gave a pointed glance at the cloak that lay tossed on the chair in the corner. His looks saying clearly that he knew Paranord had been outside the castle, and why. He's waiting outside, sire. Show him in, Paranord replied, striding over to the chair and scooping up his cloak. Did you speak with him? Only to ascertain who sent him, Hoth assured him. I knew you would want to hear his news first. The general was already at the map room door when he said this, and he beckoned to someone waiting outside. A young man in traveling stained leathers entered, looking down at the floor nervously. Your Majesty, the young man said, glancing up briefly, then looked away again. I bring you greetings and a message from Lord Anduin Lothar, commander of the Alliance. Paranord nodded and crossed to stand near the youth, tugging his cloak around him as he moved. Thank you, General. That will be all for now, he told Hath, who looked relieved as he obediently left the room, shutting the door behind him. Now, young man, Paranord continued, turning back to the messenger, what is the message you carry? Lord Lothar says you are able to bring your troops to Lordaeron, the young man replied nervously. The horde is likely to attack the city there, and your forces must aid in its defense. I see, Paranord nodded, rubbing at his chin with his fingers of one hand. He reached out and laid the other arm across the youth's shoulder. And does he expect you to report back on your progress? He asked. The messenger nodded. I see, Paranord said again. That is a shame. He turned toward the youth, his right arm tightening to tug him closer, and stabbed with a dagger in his other hand. The blade pressed up below the ribs and into the young man's heart, and jerked, blood spilling from his mouth before collapsing. Pernod caught him before he could hit the floor, and eased him down. It would have been far better if the message had been a written one, Pernod said softly to the corpse, wiping his dagger on the body before resheathing it. Then he dragged the body across the room and into the garderobe in the corner, tipping it in and listening to the dull thuds as it bumped the walls on the way down. As an afterthought, he removed his cloak, now blood-splattered beyond any hope of cleaning, and tossed it in as well. A shame. He quite liked the embroidery. After waiting a minute, Pernod closed the curtain over the garden robe and walked back across the room. If Hath was waiting outside, he would tell the general that the messenger needed to leave so urgently he allowed use of his private exit. Otherwise, he would simply tell Hath next time they met that the young man had returned to the Alliance, and of course his message had been simply to hold fast against the Horde. Pernod smiled. He could all but guarantee that no orc would force its way past the defenses. The other mountain paths were another matter entirely. Braddock clutched to the reins, but not out of fear. He had forgotten all that the first time his dragon had taken wing, carrying him high into the sky. It was amazing, soaring among the clouds, and Bardock, who had always been a dutiful warrior, but never more than content, had suddenly discovered true happiness. He was meant for this, meant to sail the skies, his massive red dragon beating its wings, the wind rushing through the crest of his hair. He still remembered the thrill of seeing flames spew from his dragon's mouth and watching the trees burst from the sudden heat that incinerated them as soon as it touched them. Glancing down, Bardock saw a stretch of silver amid the green and browns of this rich world. That was the sea. He knew the same one they had crossed after sacking the other kingdom not long ago. Tapping his dragon with his heels, Bardock urged his mount lower, and the dragon responded, furling its wings and diving down in a steep, exhilarating rush. The sea swiveled in Bardock's vision, stretching almost to the horizon, and now he could see the dark shapes strung out where the sea met the shore. Those would be their ships, the ones that had carried the Horde from the other continent to this one. Bardock hated ships. He wasn't overly fond of water either, but the air, that was a wonderful thing. Pulling his dragon out of the dive, Bardock coasted over the ships, seeing the poor orcs seated in the benches all down their lengths, pulling on the long oars that kept the boats moving. An ogre stood near the center of each ship, beating in time on a massive drum, and the orcs pulled in time, their steady strokes sending the dark ships sliding back into the water. Bardock paused abruptly and wheeled his dragon around for a second look. Yes, he had been right the first time. The ships were leaving the shore and returning to the sea. They were supposed to be sitting idly in case the Horde needed them again. Why were they moving now? Glancing around, Bardock spied a familiar figure on the lead boat. It was Gul'dan, the warlock. Bardock had feared him, as did most of the orcs, but not anymore. He was a dragon rider now. What could possibly he have to be afraid of? Angling his dragon around, Bardock swooped towards the lead ship. Gul'dan turned towards him as he approached. "Why are you taking the boats?" Bardock shouted, waving his free arm while his dragon kept pace with the ship. The warlock looked puzzled and held up both hands in confusion. Bardock coaxed his dragon closer. "You need to turn the boats around. The Horde is in Lordaeron, not across the sea," he shouted again. Still, Gul'dan gestured that he could not hear him. This time, Bardock managed to bring his dragon almost on top of the ship, so he was barely 10 feet from the warlock. "I said—" Suddenly, Gul'dan's hand shot forward, a green ray lancing from it to Bardock's chest. He felt a burst of intense pain and sensed his lungs tightening and his heart faltered, then gasped as both stopped working altogether. The world turned dark with a rush, and Bardock toppled from his saddle, narrowly missing the ship and plummeting towards the waves. His last thought was that at least he had a chance to fly. Gul'dan sneered as he watched the dragon rider's body disappear beneath the water. He needed the fool to get close enough before his magic would work, fast enough to prevent retaliation. He'd also worried what the dragon itself might do with its riders dead, and watched warily as the massive red beast reared up, tilted its head back to release a fierce cry, and beat its wings hard and shot up to the sky. Gul'dan watched long enough to make sure the dragon was not circling around for an attack, and then turned back to watching the water flow past the ship's prow. He did not see the second figure soaring high above. Torghast had been racing Bardock before his friend had spotted the ships, and had seen everything. Now he wheeled his dragon around and headed back towards Quel'Thalas at top speed. Zuluhead would want to know what happened, and Torghast suspected he would be flying off to inform the rest of the Horde, and perhaps even Doomhammer himself as well. The passes were utterly deserted as promised, and Doomhammer led his warriors through them at a fast run. He had thought the cloaked stranger would keep his word, and glad to see his guess had been correct. But still, this route was dangerous. With such narrow stone passage, it would take only a handful of warriors to block their way, and once a few bodies piled up each pass, would be too choked to allow passage of any sort. So he hurried his troops along, knowing he would be happier once they had left this cold mountain region far behind. It took them 2 days to cross the snow-covered mountains and descend into the foothills on the far side. In that time, the orcs did not see a single human. Some of the warriors even grumbled that they had missed the chance to kill anyone during their passage, but their chieftains assured them they would get their chance. On the second day, the front ranks of the Horde poured down from the mountains. Doomhammer was leading them as always, and he stopped to admire the scene before him. Beyond the foothills stretched an enormous lake, its waters glistening silvery green in the early lights. On the far side rose more mountains, marching north-south on a slight angle. The mountains the orcs had just crossed were similar, except they gleamed east as they rose. These new peaks angled west, and together the two ranges formed a gargantuan V, with the lake filling the center. And on the lake's northern shore was the majestic walled city. Capital City. Doomhammer studied it a moment, then raised his hammer high above him with both hands and bellowed a war cry. The warriors of the Horde took up the cry, and soon the hills around them were echoing with their rage and joy and bloodlust. Doomhammer laughed. The city would know he and his people were here, but after that cry, they would be quaking in their boots, and the Horde would be upon them before they could recover. To the city! Doomhammer shouted, raising his hammer again. We will crush it, and with it, the heart of the opposition. Onward, warriors! Let us bring the fight to them, while a war cry still echoes in their ears. And Doomhammer charged down, out of the foothills onto the plains, angling up and across as he focused upon the massive walled city that was his target. Chapter 16. Sire, the orcs are coming! King Taranis looked up, startled, as Morav, the guard commander, burst into his throne room. What? He stood, ignoring the panicked cries from the nobles and commoners gathered there to seek audience with him, and beckoned the commander forward. The orcs? Here? Yes, sire, the man answered. Morav was a seasoned veteran, a warrior Taranis had known since his youth, and it was shocking to see him pale and shaking. They must have come across the mountains. They're pouring into the far side of the lake even as we speak. Taranis brushed past the commander and strode out the throne room, moving rapidly down the hall and up the short flight of stairs to the nearest balcony, which stood off his wife's drawing room. Leanne was in there with her daughter Clea, and her ladies in waiting, and looking up surprised as he entered, and walked right past her. Morav trailing behind him, throwing up the windows beyond, Taranis stepped out to the balcony and stopped stunned. Normally from here he had a breathtaking view of the mountains across the lake. Those were still the same, but the strip of green he usually saw between the water and rock was now black, and he could see it shifting as he watched like ground being churned up from beneath. The Horde had indeed arrived. How did this happen? He demanded of Morav, who had stepped out as well and was staring at the sight, his mouth open. They must have come through Alterac. Why did Perrinald not stop them cold? They must have overwhelmed him, "Sire, they must have overwhelmed him, sire," Morov answered dismissively, even as his terror showing his opinions of outright king and soldiers. "Those mountain passes are narrow, and competent troops could have held the horde back. If not, they were following incompetent orders." Turnus frowned and shook his head. He shared Moreau's opinion. He had never liked Perinold, who had always struck him as selfish and scheming, but Hath, Perinold's general, was a competent commander and a solid warrior in his own right. He would have assembled a solid defense, although if Perinold gave an order, even a foolish one, Hath would probably obey it. "Send messengers to Alterac," he decided finally, "and to the Alliance army as well, letting them know our situation. We'll find out what happened later," Turnus decided, not bothering to point out that this would require them to survive until then. "First things first, rally the guards, sound the alarm, and get everyone inside the gates. We do not have much time." He glanced again across the lake, where the darkness was already creeping down the far bank and around the water. Not much time at all. Pigeons were released to the other Alliance leaders and the last known locations of the Alliance army in the hinterlands. One of those pigeons flew straight to Stormgrad, and its message was quickly untied and brought straight to Thoris Trollbane, Stormgrad's gruff master. "What?" Trollbane shouted as he read the message. He had been drinking ale from a heavy wooden mug. Now he hurled the mug at the far wall, where it shattered, leaving a streak of ale and wood splinters down the floor. "That fool! What did he do? Let them through?" Trollbane despised Perinold. Not only were they neighbors and thus rivals over borderlands, but he personally didn't dislike the man. He was too oily, too smooth by far. But even an arrogant, overdressed idiot like Perinold should have been able to block an invading army. Perhaps not stop them completely. If the horde was as numerous as Lothar had claimed, and subsequent reports had confirmed, they could muscle their way through regardless, but at least slow them down significantly, inflict heavy damage, and warn Lordaeron early enough for them to prepare properly. With the orcs already on the plains by the lake, Turnus would not have time to do much more than close his gates and brace for the first assault. Trollbane stood, began pacing. The message slipped still clenched unnoticed in his fist. He wanted to go to his friend's aid, but wasn't sure that would be the best course of action. Turnus was a fine strategist, and his guards were among the finest in the land, his gates and walls strong and thick, that he could hold out against the first wave. He was sure of that. The danger lay in letting the full horde roll down from the mountains and swarm capital city with sheer numbers. "Damn him!" Trollbane beat his fist against the arm of his heavy chair as he passed it. "Perinold should have held them. He should have at least warned us. Even he is not that incompetent." He paused mid-stride as another thought struck him. Perinold had never been enthusiastic about the alliance. He and Greymane had been the only two to resist. Trollbane remembered. He thought back to the meetings in Capital City with Lothar and Turnus and the others. Yes, Greymane had spurned the idea, but mainly because he boasted that Gilneas could crush anyone foolish enough to invade them. But Perinold had disliked the idea of combat. Trollbane had always thought his neighbor a coward at heart, and something of a bully. He was perfectly willing to fight when he knew he had the upper hand, but hated to engage in combat. If it put him at any risk, and Perinold had been the one to suggest they try to negotiate first. "That fool! That traitorous little fool!" Trollbane kicked his chair hard enough to send it skittering across the granite floor. He had done it, hadn't he? He had negotiated with the horde. Trollbane knew he was right. Perinold cared nothing for others, only for his own hide. He would happily make a deal with demons if it kept him and his own land safe, and that was exactly what he had done. It all made perfect sense now. The reason the horde had made it through the mountains without anyone raising the alarm, the reason Perinold had not responded or warned anyone, he had let them pass, presumably for some promise of leniency or continued anonymity after the war. Ugh! Infuriated beyond words, Trollbane snatched his axe from where it hung on the column beside his chair and hacked at the table in front of him, scattering it with a single blow. "I'll kill him!" he bellowed. His warriors and nobles shrank back, alarmed, and only their reactions reminded Trollbane that he was not alone, and that personal vengeance would have to wait. The war came first. Assemble the troops, he instructed his startled guards. We're going to Alterac. But sire, his guard captain replied, we've already sent half our troops with the main alliance army. Trollbane frowned. Well, there's nothing for it. Grab everyone you can find. We are lending them aid, sire, one of the nobles asked. In a matter of speaking, Trollbane replied, heffing his axe again and grinning at the man. In a manner of speaking. Lothar raised his visor and glanced around, wiping grit and sweat from his eyes with the back of his hand as he idly drew his sword across the body of a fallen orc, cleaning the blade of blood and gore that coated its length. Is that the last of them? Is that the last of them, sir? One of his soldiers asked. I don't know, son, Lothar replied honestly, his eyes still roving the trees. I hope so, but I wouldn't count on it. How many of these things are there? Another soldier demanded, pulling his axe free of the orc at his feet. The small clearing was littered with bodies. Not all of them orcish. It had been a nasty little skirmish, and the branches above were too close for wild hammers to bring the griffins to bear, so it had been entirely up to Lothar and his men. They had won, but only because a small band of orcs had apparently wandered away from the rest of the orc forces. Too many, Lothar replied absently. He grinned at his men then. But fewer now, eh? They smiled back, and Lothar felt a surge of pride. Some of these men were from Lordaeron, from Stranglethorn. One or two from Gilneas and even Alterac, and a few had come with him from Stormwind. But over the past few weeks, they had sent the regional differences aside. They were now alliance soldiers and fought together as brothers. He was proud of them. The rest of the army meshed as well as this one group did. There was hope for them all, both in this war and the peace he hoped would follow afterwards. Then he caught a flicker movement off to one side. Be ready, he warned, dropping his visor back down and sinking into a wary crouch, his sword raised to point toward the motion. The figure that burst through the trees was not an orc, but a human. One of his own soldiers. Sir! The man gasped, clearly winded. He did not seem harmed, however, and his sword was still by his side. Messages, sir. Then Lothar realized the man had a scrap of parchment in one hand and was holding it out to him. Thank you, he said, taking the message. A soldier handed the messenger a water skin, which he gratefully accepted. But Lothar was busy reading the words scribed into the small scrap, and the warriors around him tensed as they saw his jaw tighten beneath his helm. What is it, sir? One of them asked finally as Lothar glanced up, balling at the parchment between his fingers and thumb, and flicking it away like some troubled insect. There is a problem. Lothar nodded, still digesting the information he had just received. The Horde had made it to Lordaeron, he said softly, etching elascating the gaps from several soldiers. They're probably attacking the capital city now. What can we do? One of them from Lordaeron, Lothar remembered, asked urgently. We need to set out right away. But Lothar shook his head. There's too much distance between us, he told the soldier sadly. We'd never reach them in time, he sighed. No. We need to finish our work here and make sure the orcs they left in the hinterlands are dead or driven off. We cannot allow the Horde to retain a foothold here, where they could then sweep back up or down to anywhere else on the continent. His men nodded, though they did not look pleased about the prospect of wandering the woods seeking strays while their friends and families faced the rest of the Horde alone. Lothar could hardly blame them. Turalion and the rest of the Alliance army are already on their way, he assured them, making several warriors look up hopefully. He will come to the city's aid. He gripped his sword tightly. And when we are done here, we will march on the capital city and mop up any orcs that have fled the attack. The men cheered at that, and Lothar smiled, though he still felt cold. He knew they liked the idea of both helping after all, and of the alliance being so victorious. All that was left was cleanup. He hoped it would be that easy. Enough distractions, he warned his men after allowing a few seconds. Let's make sure there aren't any other orc bands near here, and then we'll head back to Airy Peak and regroup. The soldiers obediently nodded and raised their weapons, falling into rough ranks. Lothar took the lead, and together they set off into the trees again, the messenger walking in their midst. "Here they come!" Taranis glanced down and grimaced. The orc horde had crossed the lake. Sharp-straighted archers assured him they had built rough bridges from here, and it looked as if they had simply swarmed across the water like ants, and were now rapidly approaching the city walls. He was still amazed by their sheer numbers, and from what he could see upon the ramparts, they were massive brutes as well, easily as big as the largest of men and broader, with powerful muscles and large bestial heads. He did not see any siege weapons, at least, other than a thick log that was clearly intended for the battering ram. But the orcs carried what he thought were large hammers, axes, and thick swords, and he was sure they had ropes and grapples as well. Well, Capital City's walls were as sturdy as ever. No foe had ever breached its defenses, and Taranis was determined to maintain that record. They had not been able to prepare fully, of course. The people had been easy enough to gather, since most lived within the walls already. Livestock had been more problematic, and some animals had simply been abandoned to their fate, as had all but the smallest and most precious possessions. The guards had done their best to make sure everyone and everything was inside before closing and sealing the gates, but most people had fled with little more than clothes on their back and whatever tools and other possessions they had at hand. The homes would surely be destroyed by the horde, and Taranis knew it would take some time to rebuild them afterwards, assuming they drove the orcs back and were able to leave the city once more. He glanced upon the ramparts where his guards and soldiers stood ready. So few men to defend such large walls. Most of his soldiers had marched off with Lothar and the rest of the Alliance. Nor did Taranis regret that decision. The horde had needed to be stopped, and Lothar had needed every soldier that could be spared for his army. Of course, he had not expected the horde to strike at them here, and certainly not without the Alliance forces either blocking their path or marching after them in aid of the city defenses. But even if Capital City fell, if the Alliance won in the end, it would be a small price to pay. That did not mean he was about to surrender the city, however. Taranis glanced down again and judged the orcs close enough now. He could see their tusks from here, and the tusks and the tassels and bones and medals that hung around many of their necks and arms and heads, clearly trophies of previous battles. Well, they would find this fight more challenging than their previous encounters. No matter what happened, the horde would remember this fight. "Hot oil!" Taranis shouted, and down the line, Morev and others nodded. They tipped the large cauldrons over the ramparts, letting the boiling oil pour down in sheets just beyond the wall. The leading orcs almost reached the wall by then, and the oil spilled across them, drenching them utterly. Many screamed in pain as it burned away their flesh, and the entire front ranks crumpled, writhing and twitching. A few staggered away, but most did not get up. "Prepare more oil!" Taranis ordered, and servants scurried to obey, using stout poles to lift the heavy cauldrons and carry them away. It would take time to refill the cauldrons, and then reheat them and bring them back up to the ramparts, but he doubted the horde was going anywhere. This would not be a quick skirmish or a fast conflict. It would most likely be a long siege, and he thanked the Holy Light they had sufficient storages of food and water for several weeks. Oil they would run out of after another dousing or two, but it was merely the opening move in their defense. Taranis had other tricks to show these unruly orcs who dared attack his home. Thoras Trollbane stalked across the mountains as easily as if he were one of the region's sturdy rams. His heavy, hobnail boots finding solid purchase on the rough gray granite. His men moved behind him, each one well versed in mountaineering, as in combats. Stormgrad was a mountain kingdom, and his children grew up learning to climb the rock faces and scale the peaks. Ahead of him lay the first of Altmark mountain passages. Trollbane could already see figures moving through the falling snow, large, heavy-set figures, marching steadily but awkwardly. Clearly the orcs of the horde were not accustomed to the altitude of the peaks. The passes themselves were chiseled, careful out of the mountain range for just such people, allowing trade and communication with both Altmark and Stormgrad's lower neighbors. For themselves, Trollbane and his people did not need such conveniences. They preferred to scale the heights wherever they wished, rather than being trapped in a long chute like one before them. The passages were far too easy to block to blockade and to ambush. Gesturing to his men, Trollbane crouched, his axe at the ready. Not yet. Not yet. Now. Leaping over the edge, he landed softly in the pass between two orcs, taking them by surprise. His axe flashed, carving one's head from his body, and then catching the other in the throat of the backswing. Both fell, and the orcs on either side of them stumbled and snarled, raising their own weapons. But four of Trollbane's warriors dove into the pass just then, two of them either side of him, and hacked apart the next orcs in line. Then more of his men jumped down and attacked the orcs beyond those already falling, and so on in a matter of minutes. 24 orcs lay dead in the pass, and the pass was clogged with bodies. Trollbane and his men pushed the dead orcs, already stiffened from the cold, into a single stack that rose into the top of the pass. Then he stationed 10 of his men there to guard the makeshift blockade and climbed back out, taking the rest of his warriors with him. Good, Trollbane told them as they worked their way north. That one's taken care of. The next pass was less than an hour's climb away. They found that pass also crowded with marching orcs and attacked in the same way. Trollbane could see that the orcs were fearsome warriors, large and strong and tough, but they had no experience with cold or mountains and were not used to foes leaping down on them. The second pass was taken as easily as the first one, and so was the third. The fourth pass proved slightly more difficult because it was the widest of them. 4 men could walk abreast here, or 3 orcs, and so Trollbane and his soldiers jumped down 4 at a time. But soon enough it was blocked off as well, and they rolled boulders down to make sure it stayed impassable. The fifth path was clear, at least of orcs. Trollbane found warriors stationed there, but they were human, dressed in the orange of Alterac, and they were stationed above the pass as well as within. Hold! One of the Alterac soldiers called out, spotting them, and leveling his spear in their direction. State your name and business here. Several of his fellows rushed to support him. Thoris Trollbane, King of Stormgrad. Trollbane replied curtly. He glared at the soldiers though he knew they were only following orders. Where is Perinold? The king is in his castle, the same soldier replied hotly. And you are trespassing on our lands. And the orcs? Trollbane asked. Are they trespassing or guests? The orcs shall not pass us, another soldier declared. We will defend this pass with our lives. Good, Trollbane said. Only they're not at this pass. They're at the forest south of here. That startled the soldiers. We were told to guard this one of them said, looking confused. This was where they said the orcs would try and pass. Well, they didn't, Trollbane snapped. Fortunately, my men are blocking the other passes now, but many already made it through to Lordaeron. One of the soldiers was older, clearly a veteran, and his face paled at the statement as the statement stunk in. It was to him that Trollbane addressed his next question. Where is Hath? General Hath is in the next pass with the bulk of our forces, Fildor replied, considering for a second before offering. I can take you there. Trollbane knew the way, but he also knew it would be easier to get to speak with Hath if he would ride with an escort, so he nodded and gestured for his men to follow him and the Alterac soldier. It took another hour to reach the next pass. This one was the widest path through Alterac, easily broad enough for 2 full carts to pass one another without brushing the walls, and it made good sense to station most of the soldiers to guard it. If the orcs were going to north instead of south, Trollbane spotted Hath, speaking to several junior officers, but waited until the soldiers who had brought them had hailed the stout general. General Hath, sir, the man called. Visitors from Stormgrad to see you, sir. Hath glanced up and frowned when he spotted Trollbane. Thank you, Sergeant, he said, moving to join them, and returned the veteran's parting salute. Your Majesty, he said, gravely, nodding to Trollbane. General? Trollbane had always liked Hath. The man was a solid soldier and a good tactician, and a decent fellow. He had always disliked fighting him, and hoped that wouldn't be necessary this time. The orcs are pouring through your southern passes, he said bluntly. We blocked them for you. Hath paled. Our southern passes? Are you sure? He waved away Trollbane's nod. Of course you are. But why? The king told me personally they'd be passing through the north, not the south. That's why he sent us to guard these passes instead. Trollbane glanced around them. None of the Alterac soldiers were close enough to hear him as he lowered his voice. You are a fine soldier, and a good commander, Hath, he said softly. But you've always been a terrible liar. You knew they were heading south, didn't you? The Alterac general sighed and nodded. Perinold made arrangements with the Horde somehow, he admitted. Free passage in exchange for protection. Trollbane nodded. That was what he suspected. And you went along with this? He demanded. Hath stiffened. We are faced with annihilation, he replied sharply. They would have crushed all of us and slaughtered our people. There was no one to aid us. He shook his head. Perinold made the choice to protect Alterac first and foremost. What he did may not be decent, but it saved lives. And what of the lives of Lordaeron? Trollbane asked softly. They will die because you allowed the Horde to pass unhindered. Hath glared at them. They are soldiers. They know the risk. The Horde would have killed our families, our children. It's not the same. Trollbane nodded, feeling some sympathy toward the older man. No, it is not, he agreed, and your loyalty to your people is commendable. But if the Horde conquers Lordaeron, they will control the entire continent. What makes you think you will be safe? Hath sighed. I do not know, he admitted. The leader gave Perinold his word, but I don't know how far such a creature may be trusted. He shook his head. I told Perinold we should abide by our oaths to the other nations, but he countermanded that. I have sworn fealty to him, and I must obey. Plus, I thought he might be right, that this might be the only chance for our survival. He frowned. But survival of a race is more important than that of one kingdom. And if we do not have our honor, we have nothing at all. He raised his chin, a stern expression setting over his features. Well, I will reclaim our honor, he declared, then turned and shouted to his men. Corporal, gather the men. March everyone to the southern pass at top speed. We are going to assist Stormguard friends in defending those patches and push back the Orc Horde. But sir, the officer started to object. Pat shot him. Now, soldier, he bellowed, and the officer saluted quickly and leapt to obey. Then Hath turned back to Trollbane. He's in the castle, the general said shortly. He did not have to explain whom he meant. His personal guard will still be there, but there are only 20 of them. I can draw them out. But Trollbane shook his head. We do not have time to worry about him now. Besides, he pointed out, if I go there, it's an invasion. And if you go there, it's treason. He frowned. We will let the Alliance settle matters with Perinold later. For now, all that matters is blocking the Horde. The general nodded. Thank you. He then turned and joined his officers in rallying his men. Damn it, we're too late. Duralian reined in and stared over the valley below. They had ridden hard, he and Kagar and the other cavalry members, with the troops marching along behind them. It had seemed best to pass west through the foothills of Hearthglen and then emerge north of the capital city, so they could swing back down and come at the city from the wide plain behind it, where its main gates lay. Now he wasn't sure the better position had been worth the added travel time. Duralian had also hoped to gather additional troops from Thoris Trollbane, but Stormgrad was simply too far out of the way. Duralian had considered detouring, but the news that the Horde had also cut through the mountains had done so before them spurred him to keep moving instead. They had to reach Capital City in time. But now he looked down from the trailing edge of the mountain range across the valley that fed into Lordaeron and the lake below, and saw that had failed. The Horde was already there, spraying across the valley around the proud city like a spray of leaves about an autumn tree. They haven't breached the walls, Alyra pointed out, standing beside him. She and the other elves, both warriors and rangers, had kept up with the horses easily, and both she and Lorthamar Theron had come forward with him to see what lay before them. It is not too late to aid them. No, you are right, Duralian admitted, shoving his disappointment aside and studying the situation more dispassionately. This battle is not yet lost, and with our aid, the capital city will not fall. He rubbed at his chin. This may even work out to our advantage, he said softly, considering the matter more fully. The Horde does not know we are here yet, and we can trap them between us. He frowned. We should let Tyrannus know we are here, so we can coordinate our attacks, and so he does not feel he has been abandoned. Theron nodded, eyeing the massive orcs teeming below and beyond them. A good plan, he agreed. But how do you suggest we reach the city? No one can get past those warriors unharmed, not even an elf. Illyria nodded. If this were a forest, I might, she admitted. But here, and on an open plain, there's no chance for cover. It would be a suicide attempt. Khadgar, sitting on his horse on Tyralian's other side, grinned at the three of them. I can get across, he assured them, laughing at their expressions. With a little help, he added, glancing at a short tattooed figure who had aligned on the rocks beside them. Sire! Tyrannus glanced up and saw a soldier shouting and pointed beyond the walls, thinking the orcs had massed for another attack. He glanced out, following the man's gesture, but the soldier was pointing up rather than down. Tyrannus looked and almost gasped as he saw a dark figure soaring toward them. Ready the archers! He called, sharing its shape, but hold fire until my command. Something seemed strange about it. Why send a single flyer of any sort when there were thousands upon thousands of orcs smashing against the walls below? What? Was it a scout, a spy, or something else? The archers positioned themselves, longbows drawn and arrows knocked, waiting patiently. The shape grew closer. Now Tyrannus could see that it was a griffin, though far wilder and more beautiful than the heretic symbols would have led him to believe. Its feathers glowed gold and violet and red in the sunlight, and its fierce head turned, bird-like, to glance around with wide golden eyes as it approached. And a figure sat upon its back, holding reins and riding a saddle as if it was a horse. The rider was big, but did not seem large enough to be an orc, and was wearing cloth far more than the green-skinned warriors below. Tyrannus stared and let out a breath of relief as he caught the glimpse of violet. That wasn't armor. It was robes, and that could only mean one thing. Lower your weapons, he called the archers. It is a wizard of Dalaran. The griffin swooped towards them, its mighty wings beating, and then it was overhead, circling back, even as the archers turned back to watching the orcs below. The rider was clearly searching for a place to land, and finally settled on the nearby corner tower, which had a wide flat circle for cauldrons and ballista and signal fires. Tyrannus strode in that direction, Muriv right behind him and reaching the tower just as the griffin touched down and folded its wings along its body. Well, it's good to know I haven't forgotten how, the rider announced as he swung one leg over and dropped from the saddle. Thank you. Tyrannus heard him mutter to the griffin, which cawed in reply. Then the wizard turned, his short white beard visible now, and Tyrannus recognized him. Khadgar, he said, reaching out and clasping the mage's hand. What are you doing here on such a creature? I come bearing good news, the old seeming mage replied, grinning. He He looked tired, but otherwise well. Tyralian and his forces are on the other side of the northern valley, he informed Tyrannus, gratefully accepting a wineskin Muriv offered and taking a quick swallow. We will attack the horde from behind and draw them away from you. Excellent! Tyrannus clapped his hands together, pleased for the first time in days. With the Alliance army here, we can attack from two fronts and batter the orcs between us. That was Tyralian's plan, the mage agreed cheerfully. Kurdran loaned me the use of this griffin so I could reach you and coordinate. I'm just grateful I still retain the knowledge Medivh gave me on how to handle one. Come, Tyrannus told him. My servants will see to the griffin. They will get it water, and I am sure we can find something for it to eat. Let us talk about what Sir Tyralian thinks we should do next, and how we can make these foul orcs rue the day they dare raise arms against our city. Charge! Tyralian led the way, hammer held before him like a lance, spurring his horse up out of the water and onto the bank and toward the massed orc army. Many of the orcs were still concerned on the city walls, which they had yet to dent for all their ferocity, and only a few heard the sounds of his horse hooves and turned to look. One of those opened his mouth to shout a warning, but Tyralian's hammer caught caught him full across the jaw, scattering it and snapping his neck from the force of the blow. The orc dropped, and Tyralian's horse trampled him. Behind him rode the rest of the cavalry, and the foot soldiers were marching after them. Having crossed the plain north of the city, now they advanced upon the horde, which turned to meet them. And that was when the city's ballista fired, raining arrow and rock down upon the orc backs. Tyralian led his mounted soldiers into the horde's front ranks and through them, circling around and back again, and then the city's defenders struck a second time. The orcs milled about now, unsure what to do. When they faced the city, the alliance soldiers struck them from behind. When they turned toward the soldiers, the city guards attacked them, and they had yet to breach the walls, so they couldn't retreat to capital city. But they couldn't go to the lake on the plains and the mountains without first going through the alliance soldiers. No matter which way they turned, orcs died. Unfortunately, the horde had bodies to spare. A row of massive orc warriors marched forward, weapons at the ready, and Tyralian was forced to pull his riders back. The elven archers released a volley of arrows that rained down upon the orcs, felling many, but new warriors took their place at once. The orcs began throwing themselves at the alliance army, forcing them to backpedal or be crushed beneath the heavy orc bodies, and step by step, Tyralian found himself and his men pushed back towards the water. Once they were out of reach, half of the remaining horde soldiers turned their attention back to the capital city itself. They hurled themselves at the wall, quickly exhausting the city's supply of oil and rocks and gravel and other items to drop on attackers. The ballistae couldn't be aimed at anyone up against the wall, not without doing more damage to the city than the invaders could, so the orcs were now safe to scale the walls and batter at the gates. Thus far, the gates were holding, but they were taking a terrible beating, and orc warriors were reaching the ramparts and pulling stuff up and over, grinning. Most were blocked and stabbed or bashed as they reached the top before they could climb over, but a few made it and began attacking the guards, throwing them into disarray and leaving gaps in the walls' defenders. The first wave to climb over died, but more followed them, and now the bodies were piling up and providing the orcs with some cover as they scaled the walls, giving them room to plant their feet and ready their weapons for attacking the guards. "This isn't working!" Khadgar shouted to Tyralian as they backed their horses across the rough bridge the orcs must have built to traverse the lake. We don't have enough fighters to overwhelm them like this. We need to try something else." "I'm open to suggestions," Tyralian replied, battling a lunging orc with his hammer. Can't you use your magic against them?" "Yes, but it won't do much good," Khadgar answered, stabbing his sword into an orc that came too close. "I can kill him, but only a few at a time. I could summon a storm, but it wouldn't help, and it would leave me too drained to work more magic later." Tyralian nodded. "Let's get the men back across the lake and hold this bridge," he told his friend, brandishing his hammer again, even as he used his shield to knock an orc into the water that flowed beneath them. "Then we can wait until they've lost interest in us and attack again while their backs are turned." Khadgar nodded, too busy defending himself to speak. He'd hoped his new plan would work, because otherwise the horde would simply burn the bridge and keep pouring onto the city gates until they collapsed, and once the gates went, they were inside the city and would be impossible to remove. Khadgar had seen the orcs take a city once before, at Stormwind. He did not want to see it happen again. "The gates are starting to give way!" Tanner shook his head as if that would make the cry go away. He was too busy to see for himself. However, an orc had climbed the wall not far from where he stood, watching the battle below, and was advancing on him now, grinning widely enough to show its sharp tusk, swinging a heavy warhammer in slow arcs. Tyrannus reluctantly picked up a fallen sword, painfully aware that he was no fighter. Someone appeared at his side, and he recognized Muriv with some relief. The guard commander carried a long spear and jabbed at the orc, forcing him back. "You should go see the gates, sire," he said calmly, poking at the orc again. "I will handle this." On the orc's other side, Terrence could see several other guards approaching, two of them also armed with spears. Accepting that he was no longer needed here, Terrence gratefully laid down the sword and turned away. He ducked down a short flight of steps within the ramparts, coming out near a small guard's armory, and from there took a narrow walkway along the wall, and then a short stairway, and he leapt up the steps and onto the ramparts again. but now just above the main gates. He could feel the heavy pounding even before he reached the rampart's edge, rustling his teeth and making the stones shake, and looked down and saw them slamming a thick tree trunk against the front gates. Even from here, Tyrannus could tell they were shuddering from each impact. "Shore up!" he told a young lieutenant standing nearby. "Get some men and shore up the front gates." "With what, sir?" the young officer said. "Anything you can find," Tyrannus replied. He gazed out past the walls at the untold number of orcs gathering there against him and his city. Beyond them, he saw a glitter of metal on the bridge, and knew Turalian and his forces had retreated to that distance so they could plan their next move. Tyrannus just hoped it was a good one.